Welcome to today's Coffee House Bible study in Romans. Today we step into one of Paul's most confrontational claims, and it begins with a question that touches every believer's mind at some point. Have you ever heard that faith is just belief without proof? In Romans 1:18 through 23, Paul dismantles that idea with remarkable clarity. He argues that God has already placed empirical evidence of his reality into the fabric of creation itself, evidence that every culture, every generation, every human being encounters. Faith in Paul's world is not a leap into the dark, it's a response to the truth God has made evident. So settle in, open your Bible, and let's explore how Paul brings faith and reason into a powerful, unified witness.
For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. For even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man, and of birds and four-footed animals, and crawling creatures.
When Paul says in Romans 1:18 that the wrath of God is revealed from heaven, he's not talking about something being uncovered, exposed, or discovered as if we simply stumbled across a hidden truth. His idiom is more dynamic. Revealed here means actualized, put into effect, brought into history as a lived reality. Paul is describing a divine action already underway, not a secret suddenly made visible. And as we move into the paragraph beginning in verse 24, he will show us the features of this actualization, how God's wrath is expressed not through thunderbolts, but through handing people over to the consequences of their own choices. So before we read the text, keep this idiom in mind. Paul's not saying God's wrath has been noticed. He's saying that it has been set in motion. This is the engine driving the whole section. Ungodliness and unrighteousness in Paul's idiom form a loaded pair of ideas that describe both the root and the fruit of a life lived without reference to God. Ungodliness is the posture. It's the decision to inhabit God's world as if God were not there, as if his presence, his claims, and his glory were irrelevant. And once a person adopts that posture, unrighteousness follows as the predictable outcome. The behaviors we call immoral are not random. They are lived expressions of a godless framework. In other words, when people choose to erase God from their horizon, they inevitably begin to act like those who have no horizon at all. Paul wants us to see that the moral collapse he describes is not the cause of their ungodliness, but the consequences of it. A godless society doesn't merely drift away from the truth, it actively suppresses it. Paul says they hold down the truth in unrighteousness, and that suppression has layers. They suppress the truth about God's existence, because acknowledging him would require acknowledging his claim on their lives. They suppress the truth about his glory, because to admit his greatness would expose their own smallness. They suppress the truth about the consequences of their behavior, because unrighteousness can't survive honest self-examination. And they suppress the truth about the long-term effects of living in an ignorance of God, because facing that future would shatter the illusion of autonomy. Paul wants us to see that this is not passive ignorance. It is a deliberate, determined refusal to let the truth speak. Paul says that what may be known about God is within them. And here his idiom doesn't mean a private, mystical awareness tucked inside the individual soul. He means among them, woven into the shared consciousness of human cultures. In other words, God's existence was not unknown to them, nor was it absent from their collective experience. Every human society carries some hint, some echo, some fragment of awareness that there is a God above them, whether through consciousness, tradition, story, or the sheer wonder of the created world. Humanity has never been truly God ignorant. Paul's point is the knowledge of God was already present among them, circulating in their cultural bloodstream, and their rejection of it was deliberate, not accidental. Paul says, for God made it evident to them. And this is where he cuts straight across the modern notion that faith is believing something that cannot be proven. In Paul's mind, there is no argument between faith and reason. Faith in God rests in facts, on evidence. God himself has woven into the world and placed before every human culture. In this context, Paul is talking about empirical information, the created order, the beauty, the power, the design, the sheer undeniability of a world that points beyond itself. God has made his reality evident, not hidden. Humanity's problem is not a lack of proof. It is the refusal to accept the proof that God has already provided. So, they are without excuse. With that phrase, Paul circles back to his earlier assertion that God has already poured out his wrath on human society, and he tells us why that wrath is deserved. Because humanity has unrighteously suppressed the very proof that God supplied. The evidence of God's reality was not hidden. It wasn't subtle, not inaccessible. It was placed before them, among them, around them, within their cultural consciousness, and they pushed it down. They refused the knowledge provided. They rejected the clarity he gave. And they silenced the testimony of creation itself. Paul's point is sharp. God's wrath is not arbitrary. It is the righteous response to a long-term deliberate suppression of truth that should have led them to honor him. Paul says, in their foolish heart was darkened. And the question naturally arises, did God darken their hearts, or did they do it to themselves? In this context, Paul is simply tracing the outcome of a godless posture. When people suppress the truth, when they push down the evidence God has placed among them, when they choose ungodliness as their operating framework, foolishness is not an imposed judgment. It is the inevitable result. Their hearts became darkened because they have shut out the light. This is Paul's point. The darkness is self-inflicted. It's what happens when a society insists on living without God, suppressing what he has made plain, and embracing a worldview that cannot sustain wisdom. The darkened heart is not a mystery. It is predictable harvest of a true suppression. Paul continues, professing to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man and of birds and four-footed animals and crawling creatures. Yes, excuse me. Paul is speaking about idolatry, but we must not miss the deeper irony he's exposing. A godless world is never truly without a God. Human society does not become atheist in the strict sense. It becomes self-referential. When people suppress the proof about the real God, They do not end up with no God at all. They end up creating one of their own in their own image. God that doesn't confront them, doesn't command them, doesn't correct them. A God that reflects their desires rather than reshapes them. Paul's point is that idolatry is not merely the worship of statues. It is the inevitable outcome of a culture that refuses the glory of the incorruptible God and replaces him with something manageable, familiar, and ultimately foolish. Isaiah makes this same point with cutting clarity. He doesn't merely mock people for carving a statue out of wood or shaping a figure from metal. His critique goes deeper. They aren't just crafting an object, they're crafting a God. They invent his narrative, his personality, his temperament, his rules, his do's and don'ts. They script his expectations and limits. In other words, they bow down to their favorite fictional character, a deity of their own imagination who conveniently reflects their desires and never confronts their sin. Isaiah and Paul stand shoulder to shoulder here. Idolatry is not simply the worship of a statue. It is the creation of a God who behaves exactly the way the worshiper wants. Romans 1:18 through 23 takes the student to one of Paul's most sobering analysis of the human condition. He begins by saying that the wrath of God is revealed, and in Paul's idiom, that doesn't mean uncovered, it means actualized. Paul's wrath is already at work in human society, not through dramatic punishments, but through consequences of a world determined to live without him. Paul describes a culture that chooses ungodliness, living as if God does not exist, and then inevitably produces unrighteousness, the moral collapse that flows from that godless posture. And instead of responding to the truth God placed among them, Paul says that they suppressed it. They suppressed the truth of his glory, the truth about the consequences of their behavior, and even the truth about the long-term effects of living in ignorance of God. This is not passive confusion, it's deliberate resistance. Paul adds that what may be known about God is within them, meaning among them, woven into the shared awareness of every human culture. God's existence was not unknown. Every society carries some echo of him. And Paul presses further. God made it evident to them. Here he contradicts the modern idea that faith is believing in something that can't be proven. Paul sees no conflict between the faith and reason. Faith rests on facts, on empirical evidence. God himself has embedded in creation. Humanity's problem is not a lack of proof. It's the refusal to accept the proof that God has already provided. That's why Paul says they are without excuse. God's wrath is deserved because they unrighteously suppress the evidence he supplied. Then Paul describes the inevitable outcome. Their foolish heart was darkened. And the darkness in Paul's logic is self-inflicted. When people shut out the light, darkness is a natural result. A society that suppresses truth becomes foolish, and its heart becomes darkened. Finally, Paul shows us where this leads. Professing to be wise, they became fools, exchanging the glory of incorruptible God for images of humans, birds, animals, and crawling creatures. This idolatry, this is idolatry, but not merely the worship of statues. A godless world is never truly without a God. Human society doesn't become atheist. It becomes self-inventing. It creates a God in its own image, a God who never confronts, never commands, never corrects. Isaiah saw the same thing. He mocked those who carve a figure from wood, not because they made a statue, but because they made a God, complete with a narrative, personality, rules, expectations, and limits. They bowed down to their favorite fictional character. Paul's point is that idolatry is the inevitable outcome of truth suppression. When people reject the glory of the real God, they will always replace him with something smaller, safer, and ultimately foolish. Paul's words invite us to look gently but honestly at our own world. Idolatry isn't just an ancient practice, it's a modern pattern also. We may not carve statues from wood or stone, but we still create gods in our own image. Ideas, identities, lifestyles, and cultural narratives that promise meaning without accountability, comfort without truth, and freedom without holiness. And when a society builds its own gods, it inevitably inherits the same foolishness Paul describes, a kind of moral and spiritual confusion that grows darker over time. So as we finish this passage, let me encourage you to pause and ask, where do we see these patterns today? Where does our culture exchange the glory of the incorruptible God for something Paul isn't, for something smaller and safer and more familiar? Paul isn't just diagnosing the ancient world. He's inviting us to recognize the idols that quietly shape our own. And in seeing them, we're invited back to the real God, the one who gives light, wisdom, and life. As we leave this passage, Paul has shown us the inner logic of a world that suppresses the truth and builds its own gods. But he's not finished. In the very next paragraph, beginning in verse 24, Paul will show us what happens when God allows that idolatry to run its course. He moves from the diagnosis to the consequences, the exchange of God's glory to the unraveling of human life. So in our next study, we'll follow Paul as he describes what it looks like when God hands over a society to the path that it has chosen. It's a sobering section, but an essential one, because it helps us understand not only the ancient world, but the patterns we see unfolding in our own. Join me next time as we step into Romans 1:24 through 32 and watch Paul trace the results of a world determined to live without God. We're building a space for honest, grace-filled discovery. If that sounds like something you want to be part of, subscribe and click the bell to stay connected. Thanks for watching.